Every day about 440 people die in Australia. We've lost around 2 days, less than 2 days of additional deaths from COVID in Australia. But we probably have lost a couple of weeks of additional deaths, at least from other causes caused by lockdowns. And these, by the way, those additional deaths, I'm objecting. I'm calling them a crime against humanity, and I'm going to fight them. I'm calling it public health terrorism. It is no less than public health terrorism. And there's a big difference between the death caused by a virus and the death caused by a policymaker. You know, when we do any public policy, we are expecting to save lives. We're not expecting to take more lives, but the lockdowns are actually taking lives. Extra testing has not reduced your mortality. It is also very problematic, but it's caused hysteria. People are just hysterical now. They just cannot think. They've just lost their ability to use their reason. So I think the whole concept here was the most unscientific way to deal with the pandemic. Neil Ferguson and also, by the way, the Melbourne University modelers were wrong, and they better take responsibility. And the problem of this whole business is that the groupthink that occurs in governments, where we are not allowed to actually look at those models and offer the government alternative advice. If the government shuts its mind and shuts its eyes and says, I'm not going to use all my, how many, 5,000 or 10,000 bureaucrats that they have, all these public servants, they say, I'm not going to use all of them, but I'll just use some university's model and I will just believe in that. I think they basically wasted all the money on paying us.
Welcome to Frank Talk. Today my guest is Sanjeev Sabhlok. Welcome, Sanjeev.
Thank you, Albert, for having me.
It's my absolute pleasure. So, Sanjeev, for some of our listeners that would know you are you able to introduce yourself and your background in a brief manner?
I was a civil servant in India, a senior civil servant for about 18 years. I joined what is called the Indian Administrative Service in 1982, held very senior positions like secretary to the government and so on. Then I realized that the system out there needs a lot of changes. The system is not going to work for the people. So I actually resigned that role, and I attempted to form a liberal party, a liberal political party in India. Didn't happen immediately, but it's happened finally. In 2013, I managed to get a liberal party started in India, the first one ever. Well, I wouldn't say the first one ever, but the big one right now. And so that's been my main passion, right? Fixing the governance system of India. So I had a PhD from USA in economics. I decided I want to go to Australia because I'd also studied here in Perth for 1 year in the Curtin University. And I liked the place, and I had my sister-in-law, brother-in-law here. So I just came over here to see if I can park myself while I focus on India. And I got a job which is really good because I'm learning a lot as an economist in the Department of Treasury and Finance. I've been here for 15 years in that department, and 5 years before that in another organization, Victorian Worker Authority. So that's been my background. That my focus has been 99.99% on India. Okay, so I worked here basically to learn about good governance and to transmit that message to India. So all my books and writing, you'll find I'm talking great things about Australia's system. Okay, I'm going to the villages in India, and I'm educating the young people. I'm building a political party, a movement in India to reform the country, and I'm sitting here to learn. Okay, so that's been my background. And then I suddenly find that, hey guys, it's not working here. Something has gone wrong here itself, rather than my trying to fix India. I need to get out and do something here maybe. And that's what happened very suddenly. It was very, very sudden. And I think I decided I need to get out and be a commentator in these very difficult times. And you are right now in Melbourne as well, I understand. And
yes, and I'm actually in my farm in near the Yarra Valley.
Yes, beautiful.
Yes. The rules are that wherever you were on that first night of confinement, that's where you have to spend the rest of your confinement time. So I was lucky to be in the country. So it was never totally stage 4, and now it's a little bit more relaxed. But let's go back to you, Sanjeev. It is so interesting, so that you are actually a political leader. That's what you are saying.
Absolutely. In India, I'm definitely a political leader. You could say I'm the founder of India's, the major liberal political party, which is very small. But remember, everything starts very small. I'm not worried.
In India, small doesn't mean small necessarily for Australians. How many members do you have in your party?
It is, we are very fussy. I would say we have members maybe about 300, and supporters maybe about 50,000 or a bit more. But really, we're very fussy in putting out candidates for our elections. So we've contested the parliamentary elections in 2019, and we haven't. We're very slow. I'm very clear that we don't want people who are opportunists or who will believe in socialism. And in India, by the way, you'll practically not find anyone who doesn't believe in socialism. So therefore, I'm in this business very slow and steady for the next, the party has to go on for the next 100 years. I don't see India changing overnight. It's going to be extraordinarily difficult. So no, it is a really, really small party, but we have a good presence in the media. I write op-eds in the Times of India, which is the world's largest English newspaper. I write centerpiece articles. I have a blog on that where I've written hundreds of articles. Well, not hundreds, maybe more than 100, let's say. So yeah, I've got a fair bit of presence in India. And the head of the government bureaucracy in India, Rajiv Gauba, for example, right now, the cabinet secretary, he is my batchmate. That is, we were recruited into the Indian Administrative Service at the same time. There's just about 100 people recruited every year in India. It's an extraordinarily elite civil service. And so let's say that everybody in India who matters knows about me. But nobody knows about me in Australia, which is great.
Yes, it's quite extraordinary, the background and the journey. So let's, if you don't mind, let's go back one step. When you were in India, what actually prompted you said to come to Australia? Can we focus on that just to understand what's the mindset? How did you think that you would be able to learn about liberalism here in Australia? Because I see that you have a PhD also from a university in Southern California.
Yes.
So why not the United States? Why Australia?
Well, the step one is the answer is that I had a J1 visa for studies. Under J1, you cannot go back. I think till 2 years or something after the thing. So that is the first thing, that the USA was ruled out. So I was basically very determined to be in India. So I had come back after my PhD in 1999. I was the commissioner of in the government of Meghalaya, state government, commissioner and secretary. And I was on the side. I was trying to talk to a few people who were intellectuals and see whether we can get a party up and running. And I realized it's not going to happen, and it's going to be a very, very long journey. And so for me, the idea was I'm not going to stay in the bureaucracy in India, which is extraordinarily incompetent and corrupt, and I have to fight these guys publicly. I can't be sitting inside and saying things against them. And so I had to leave. And the US was not an option at that stage, as I said. I would have loved to be in USA because I think that is the world's freest country by any, in terms of at least the theoretical structures or the systems of the constitution. But then I had been in Australia, as I mentioned, in Perth, in the Curtin University. And I had realized that coming here, I had spoken to obviously a lot of academics while I was here in Perth, that yes, this country does believe in good governance and good systems. So we had very good, professors in the Curtin University. I therefore believed that Australia is almost as good as USA in terms of defense of liberty. And I was actually right. I came here and I was very happy to find very systematic governance systems. For example, the Workover Authority I mentioned, the WorkSafe Victoria. I was really, really delighted to see that inspectors from here in Australia don't go to the companies and demand bribes. In India, the first thing the inspector goes, the health and safety inspector will go and demand a bribe from the business to allow them to operate. India is an inspector Raj, a rule of inspectors. Okay, it's a very corrupt country. So I also realized that these guys are very willing to learn about good risk management. So interestingly, when I was recruited in the Workover Authority, there were two candidates with PhD. I came to know later. There were two PhD candidates at the same time, one from Australia and one was me. And they recruited me. And the reason is because they realized that they have a gap in certain skills, like in economic thinking and in programming. And I did SAS programming and a few things at that stage. And so I managed to be recruited in preference to a local PhD in that who specialized in that area, which shows the openness of this society here to actually get an alternative view. And I contributed a lot. I learned a lot and I contributed a lot by devising risk-based strategies, for example, to deal with health and safety in schools in Victoria. So I went around to all the schools. I became the executive client manager as an executive role. I was the head of the, let's say, the work cover authorities relationship with all the education sector, the schools, government schools, Catholic schools, and all other schools. In the meanwhile, then of course, I being an economist, I got I was roped in, and I enjoy working in an economic role, which is why I became a permanent member of the Department of Treasury and Finance. So there as well, just to continue the narrative of the good governance, and there's a very good Victorian guide to regulation in the state, which is also similar to what is applied in different parts of Australia, and the guide really is about how a good policy is made. And virtually everything that you see here in Victoria, all the policies have gone through a very systematic process. And that process is what determines good outcomes. And you bring in all the experts, bring in all the stakeholders, let them express their views, look at the costs, look at the benefits. Maybe you don't quantify them, it's not necessary. You don't have to quantify everything. But once you understand the issues and it's publicly discussed, you can come to the better answer. And that's why I was really happy learning this thing. I worked in a number of areas, including water policy, agriculture policy, forestry, general regulation policy, urban planning. That includes, the work that you do. For example, I notice you're a property developer. So, it's how can we facilitate businesses and to reduce the unnecessary regulation in the urban planning space, and local government reform. So I've been doing a range of, let's say, economic policy matters, advising the Treasurer of Victoria through my executives, of course. There are people who are senior to me. And so my job is to advise the Treasurer on these matters. And I was really, really happy that, yes, Australia does meet the benchmark of a good governed, well-governed society. So that I did not lose anything much by not going to USA.
So when you joined the department, there realized that you were a political leader in India. Have you had any contacts with the Premier himself or other political leaders here in Victoria and in Australia? Hello everyone, thank you for watching Frank Talk. And if you are watching us on YouTube or Facebook, please hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to leave us a comment. If you are listening to us on the podcast, give us a 5-star review and a comment. And I won't take any more of your time. Let's go back to the show.
Albert, I had really no need to contact anybody here. There wasn't anything that these leaders here, the local leaders of Victoria or Australia, can do to help India's misgovernance. There is nothing they can do, and they should not. That's the other point I want to emphasize. I would rather not have our political party in India contaminated by political leaders from Australia saying something about it. Okay, you get the point. It has to be it has to be people from India. My job is to mentor them, build the leaders local. So I'm sitting here writing, building, educating, visiting the villages, visiting the colleges, giving talks. That's part of my mentoring and leadership building role in India. And I would never want an Australian leader to try to do that. Okay, let's say it's a political suicide for a political party in India to say, I'm going to get people from outside India to come and tell us. Now, I am a different case because I have got what is called the overseas Indian citizenship. I'm officially a citizen of Australia, but I've also got the overseas citizenship of India, which gives me permanent residency there, as well as the right to be a member of a political party, although I am not allowed to contest elections. So I have the legal right, and so there was no need for me. And second, by the way, let me just add to this point. I did not find, and until today, I do not find the leaders of India in Australia. There are a few who are in the right direction. I thought John Howard was very good. I thought Tony Abbott's done well on many occasions. I really rarely came across leaders here whom I would really admire, let's say that, so that I didn't feel the need to go and run after and meet anybody at all. I was happy to be in the complete darkness in Australia, doing my work as a bureaucrat, advising the government on policy and really focusing my mind on India.
Mm-hmm. So you are no longer in the darkness, my friend. So all the good governance that you were talking about before, How did that translate with this health crisis?
Look, the emergency power, I think, made all the difference here. So what happens in emergency situations and the powers is that most of the normal processes are abandoned. I had not experienced any emergency in Australia or even in the West. I'd not heard of these kind of emergencies in the past. I didn't realize that these powers can actually backfire really badly. Now, I realized later, and this is something about 5 months after that or 4 months after this, that in Sweden, they had the same problem 100 or more years ago, something of this line. And the society then decided that they cannot give these kind of emergency powers to the politicians except during war. So when there's a war, by all means have the emergency powers, but in peacetime, in Sweden, you cannot restrict any liberty. You cannot restrict any liberty unless you have an individual order given to an individual saying, I ask you to quarantine yourself, and that individual retains the right to go to court and get that cancelled. So the idea that liberty can be, curtailed on such a mass scale, which has happened now, I think it's been unprecedented in the past. Nobody ever tried it, at least in the last 100 years. It's not commonly been tried. And I think that's the first thing that happened. As you say, what about the policy process? Well, it got deranged from day one. I actually wrote to my bosses within the department, even though I'm not involved in the actual drafting of the Victorian policies on this lockdown, etc. I have been involved in many other related policies, but I won't go there. But in the case of this particular thing, it was very obvious. If you look at the data that was coming in February, now you remember I have this risk assessment approach. And so, work cover, I had worked on risk assessment and so on. So the data were coming in that the elderly are extraordinarily more vulnerable to death than the younger people. And that data was telling me, and I explained that to my bosses, I put it in writing, send a copy to my senior boss, not the senior most, but my senior most, let's say, boss in the area where I work. Explaining to them that, look, I'm hoping that there'll be a risk assessment conducted of this pandemic's impact, and that policies will be designed based on the actual risks. And it's all there in writing. I was told that, no, sorry, but this is not a matter for us in DTF, it's a matter for the DHHS. And I think that's the emergency power. So what happens is, during emergencies, the central agencies of the government no longer have the capacity to advise on critical aspects of public policy, because the department is given almost complete control. And normally what happens is, if a department is doing something, we have the ability to come on top and also look at it from different angles and then advise the government. That process, I'm not sure if it happened at all. So that's where I believe the policy process did not occur, and I'll be writing a little bit about in detail. I've already written about this in my Fin Review article, but I'll write a bit more in detail in a paper that I'm working on at the moment.
So it is interesting, though, that working in the Department of Treasury, that you were not involved in the projections of the models, even in the manufacturing of those models that were predicting the number of infections and so on. Are you familiar with the models that are used in Victoria to make those predictions? I remember early in the onset, they were talking about possibly 150 to 200,000 deaths. And therefore, very quickly, they said that they saved 150,000 lives. It didn't make any sense. So I actually zoomed in a little bit to see what's in those models, and I've discovered that there is one variable that make or breaks the model. It's called, I believe, the R0, or it could be the R1 or the R2.
R0,
you can explain
you're spot on.
what that is, but as soon as there is a variable that's different there, the assumption is different, then the model can be totally out of whack, and of course that is an influencer of policy.
Albert, you're so spot on here. This is one of the big issues. I've been raising this in meetings as well. I've been talking to people in the department 6 months ago that we actually need to get involved in the modeling We have a lot of expertise in the treasury, a lot of number-oriented people, number-crunching people, okay? People like me as well. And we're very familiar with these kind of things. We can actually pick them up quickly and run with them. But I don't think the government asked the treasury to do anything of the sort. They were not asked to look at the models that were being produced by the universities. And in the meanwhile, as I told you, I have been working on the India project. So I have written 17 articles in the Times of India, 17 of them in the last 6 months. And in 2 or 3 of them, I have discussed these models very carefully. One of them was actually a critique of Neil Ferguson's model. Neil Ferguson's model is, and the R0. I've actually identified the R0, and I've cited a lot of scientific literature, which says that R0 is a theoretical construct. It is never to be used in practice because it cannot be assessed. It is something that only is discoverable after the pandemic is over. You cannot really get the value of R0 prior to the pandemic. Okay, so there's a lot of scientific literature says that R0 is not a valid thing to use for prognosis. And as Anders Tegnell in an interview I think I was watching him just yesterday or something, he basically said clearly and that models are not meant for making prognosis. They're meant for assessing alternative policy options. These models are not robust enough to tell you how big is the pandemic going to be. They cannot do that. For that, you need to use a lot of other live data on the spot. So Anders Tegnell, I've been watching almost every video that he's ever come in. And basically, these guys in Sweden, they've got 500 people who are focusing only on public health. And they have themselves looked at the data as it was evolving and concluded that Neil Ferguson was wrong. Neil Ferguson and also, by the way, the Melbourne University modelers were wrong. And they better take responsibility. And the problem of this whole business is that the groupthink that occurs in governments where we are not allowed to actually look at those models and offer the government alternative advice. If the government shuts its mind and shuts its eyes and says, I'm not going to use all my, how many, 5,000 or 10,000 bureaucrats that they have, all these public servants, they say, I'm not going to use all of them, but I'll just use some university's model and I will just believe in that. I think they basically wasted all the money on paying us. Why were they paying us money if we're not used to ask questions?
Critical thinking.
Yes.
Yeah. There is another variable that influences the policy setting, and that's the sensitivity of the PCR test. You know about that?
Yes, absolutely. The sensitivity, specificity, yes, all that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the Professor Raoul is the French professor. If you go to Expertscape, which is the database where you find all the specialists in the world, and you type there virologist, and you will see that he comes on the top. That means that fellow is one of the top virologists in the world. He's, by the way, the guy that came up with the hydroxychloroquine. And he had the unfortunate issue that Donald Trump talked about hydroxychloroquine very soon after he made his first publication on the subject. And as a result, the hydroxychloroquine became political to this day, really. Yes. But Professor Raoul, I believe it was on the 26th of March where he published another paper talking about the PCR test and those cycle thresholds.
Yeah.
So apparently, if you use more than 30 cycles to zoom in to the virus, what you find is dead material. And so Raoult recommended to use 30 to 33 cycles. And in the United States, they're using 37 to 40. An article in the New York Times recently suggested that at that level, 90% of the positive results are false positives. You're aware of that, yes?
Yes, I look at it here, Albert, and I think that's the way that Anders Tegnell has been arguing from the very beginning, is that we must go back to the fundamentals, even beyond this testing concept. We must go back to the fundamentals of when should we test? And for flu-like viruses, the only time that the World Health Organization's, 2020, October 2019 recommendations on non-pharmaceutical interventions on flu-like pandemics. And any other literature, the only time that they have recommended these kind of things is for the early contact tracing when the virus is at a very early stage. Okay, these tests are not recommended for a pandemic once it has actually begun. And second, for flu-like pandemics. And the only time these are ideally required to be tested, and it is the way that flu testing is done, is only when you're hospitalized. At that point, they need to know what exactly you've got, and so they do testing, and they do repeat testing, not once, but many, many times, to make sure that you actually have a flu, or what kind of flu, or what kind of, in this case, coronavirus. So the testing concept that has been done, I think people like Martin Kulldorff, who's actually a professor in Harvard Medical School, I've been in very close touch with him. They've actually argued that the testing regime that's been created for this pandemic is completely unprecedented and not at all consistent with the existing literature and recommendations. We are not supposed to go around testing all kinds of people, asymptomatic, symptomatic but mildly symptomatic. The only point is here, the only focus of the medical system, Albert, is to prevent deaths. And so the idea is when somebody is getting serious symptoms, you immediately test him and you treat him accordingly. So I think the testing regime, this also reminds me, is not just the problem with the testing regime, it's also the problem with the recording of the COVID deaths. The data, therefore, since I'm a data man, I am aware that the entire data, including the modeling numbers and assumptions, including the PCR testing numbers and the dodginess or whatever, the problems with that particular kind of numbers, and finally the data of actual reporting of COVID deaths. All these are currently very, very badly contaminated. And I really think that when this is looked back upon in time by the people who are the researchers, they will just call it the great hysteria. There are so many things that have been done that have been really unnecessary from all the scientific literature. So the paper that I'm writing, I will discuss all these matters. It's a short paper of 15,000 words, about 5,000 words. I'll explain all these matters in detail, and that, science was very, 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 very clear. You do not do any of these things. You do not. Yes, you do have some border controls. You can have quarantine. You can have individual quarantine. You can't have mass quarantine for these kind of pandemics. And you do not test unnecessarily. That's just causing panic. So do you know, Albert, I'm sure you know, that this whole business of testing and the business of advertising by Dan Andrews in this case, but also all over the world, and the hysteria by the media, by the way, all the dead people here, the bodies being buried. The average person in this country and in the world thinks that 100 times more people have died from this pandemic than the actual number. It's that bad that the hysteria, so this extra testing has not reduced your mortality. It is also very problematic, but it's caused hysteria. People are just hysterical now. They just cannot think. They've just lost their ability to use their reason. So I think the whole concept here was the most unscientific way to deal with the pandemic. And here's the problem, Albert. These guys have had 30 years or more to prepare for such things. They have, and by the way, they actually have documents about what to do in which case. And they did not follow any of that. The moment this happened, they just went haywire. There is an article, in fact, I was reading, where the Chinese World Health Organization representative, in the representative of WHO in China, made a statement in, February, that when Wuhan locked down, he said, this has never ever been done in history, and this is not part of the WHO recommendations. He made it very, very clear that what China was doing was not recommended. Next comes the Italian case, and as you're aware, they did not put the lockdowns initially. But I think at some stage, they just had a bit of a hysterical fit, a hissy fit of some sort, all the policymakers and others, and they decided to shut down Italy itself. And I think the Western nations thought that this is not just a communist thing, because we are used to China doing stupid things all the time, and nobody in the West copies China ever, for anything. Okay, we are very clear, China is a separate part of the world, they're really problematic, let's not even go there. So, but when Italy did that, my suspicion here, and I think we'll work out later, once Italy did that, I think the Western leaders lost faith in themselves. They thought that maybe that if Italy is doing it, maybe that's what we should do. And you're aware of the WHO's chief. He was a member of the Communist Party of Ethiopia for the most of his life. He's a communist. He's a hardcore communist. So he loved these lockdowns. He kept saying it's a great thing China has done. But China's own representative of WHO said this is not consistent with WHO guidelines. So I think this science was immediately thrown on the side. The testing concept you raised was just one of the mistakes made, over-testing, I call it. And in the end, we have what is called the great hysteria. Never in human history, 5,000-year history, we've seen a situation like this.
Yes, but you still have that issue that if you are doing those PCR tests and those cycle thresholds are too great, then you will get false positives. And that's one of you cannot get away from that problem because it influences the immediate policy. That's why they're so obsessed with the number of cases that they get per day. But if they know that they are actually there is a 10% false positive versus 90% false positive, the policy response surely is going to be different. But in any case, to go back to what you said about Italy, I was in Europe when this started, and I remember that the Italians brought over one of the Chinese experts from China, from Wuhan, to advise them. So all the lockdown and so on in Italy actually
started with that Chinese expert.
Yeah, it started with the Chinese.
There we
effectively.
There you go. You got the answer now.
Now you've got various responses now. What they found out, for instance, currently in France, the lockdowns. Like a person has to isolate himself for 7 days only. So what they found out is that the virus is much less virulent now, and they've reduced, as a consequence, the time that you have to isolate. There is a lot more cases now in France, but what they're finding is that the mortality has totally gone down. So it seems, and there is someone at Monash University that's tracking the mutations of the virus, and last time I spoke to him a week or so ago, there were about 270 mutations that have been tracked already. Therefore, it would not be at all surprising that this thing is going to get down to the grade of a flu. However, the way that the Premier is talking on a daily basis and the vocabulary that is being used, Sanjeev, that is the vocabulary of Fidel Castro. I'm not trying to caricature him here,
you're right,
but he's talking with the fear in mind. He's just instilling the fear of God on people. He's suspending our thinking. That's what he's trying to do.
Yes.
So what is the agenda here when he's on one hand, this is the guy that mismanaged the whole thing 3 months ago with the hotel quarantine. He's putting it on the people on a daily basis. Like I heard, the last conference I heard was on Friday when there were 14 cases, apparently due to the fact that some family members have been mixing with other family members. That's forbidden in his book. But he was talking about those billions of dollars that those people are costing to the economy, when in actual fact, he's the one A, chose the policy response, B, he mismanaged the whole thing, and therefore is just keep on pushing back to make people as guilty as possible. I mean, until when are we going to be tolerating this? I see, unfortunately, you're a casualty of this mismanagement because you couldn't tolerate it anymore, so you jumped out. I'm sure some of your colleagues are thinking, well, what's the point of jumping out now? This guy is not going to last, or, there's always a change in government. Usually the public servants outlive their political masters.
Always,
so in general, you get the last words, right?
Yes, absolutely. So I think your point's well taken about Dan Andrews not taking advice from anybody apart from people who sort of say, yes, Dan, you're absolutely right. This is the dangerous virus. This is worse than Spanish flu, like Brent Sutton. He's been constantly comparing this with Spanish flu. Well, as you rightly said, apart from the mutations, and by the way, I just want to add here that I don't believe that the mutations are significant enough to make the Australians safe. So there is no possibility that the Australians will remain safe once the virus enters Australia in a big way. So the safe, it will still be as bad as the Asian flu or the Hong Kong flu. It's not going away, that virus. But the only point to remember was that this virus is only going to affect the very, very elderly. Okay, it's a very almost no effect on the young. So the way that Sweden did that was to make the recommendations to people to let the schools continue, so there's no effect at all on children, and by the way, the teachers as well, there was no effect, and to then allow and to take special care of the elderly. And he acknowledges that the elderly, they couldn't take care of properly, adequately in the initial stages. But Dan Andrews is not either interested in that information. He is not protecting Australians because the virus will actually come and hit us. So there'll be no end. In the end, the number of deaths in Australia that would have happened with proper care and preventions will still happen. Okay, the only time when it will not happen is if you get a vaccine very quickly. But here's the point, Albert. This is the very big point to remember. There's a big difference between the death caused by a virus and the death caused by policymaker. When we do any public policy, we are expecting to save lives. We're not expecting to take more lives, but the lockdowns are actually taking lives. My early estimates of suicides in India is that an additional 50,000 people have already taken their lives in India because of the lockdowns in India. Now, the numbers coming in from USA and UK, they are suggesting tens of thousands of people are likely to die from additional, cancer that was preventable, heart disease that was preventable. And so the numbers are coming in from all over the world that these lockdowns have proved a killer. They're absolutely disastrous because they may save a few lives, COVID lives, but remember, they're only temporarily saving unless you get a vaccine. They don't really protect you. They don't kill the virus from the planet Earth. None of these lockdowns can do that. And that's exactly why the literature never recommended lockdowns. But rather than flattening the curve, which was the sensible approach, they kept the ICUs empty. They're almost completely empty. Nurses have written to me about that now. I'm getting I'm the public now, so people are telling me things which I would not know otherwise.
Good.
But the ICUs are basically being kept empty in Australia. And we never flattened the curve. All we did was we went around killing a lot of other people. I don't know how many will be killed in Victoria. I don't want to put numbers, but they would be well into the hundreds, if not thousands. And those are additional deaths caused by the lockdowns. Suicides, and by the way, I spoke with a guy called Matt Lawson the other day, just 2 days ago. A young man from somewhere in Melbourne, I think near the beach side or something, he said. Brighton, I think he said. And he's got a lot of followers, listen to him. And basically he tells me that every week around 15 messages he's getting, 15 messages from young people who are telling him that they're completely now, ready to take their own lives. So I've also, seen on Alan Jones's report that a number of, suicide cases are being reported by the undertakers. So when the numbers finally are added up, Albert, we'll find that while we have lost maybe 2 days worth of additional deaths in Australia from COVID, because every year 160,000 people die in Australia, and every day about 440 people die in Australia. We've lost around 2 days, less than 2 days of additional deaths from COVID in Australia, but we probably have lost a couple of weeks of additional deaths, at least from other causes caused by lockdowns. And these, by the way, those additional deaths, I'm objecting. I'm calling them a crime against humanity, and I'm going to fight them. I'm calling it public health terrorism. It is no less than public health terrorism, where you actually terrorize the people so that they do not go to the GP to check them, their heart position, or they're so terrorized that they're so afraid to get any remedies, and they are so terrorized they just commit suicide. Okay, so that public health terrorism that has been created in Victoria, I believe has been a disaster, and I think we need laws to punish the ministers and the premiers who actually impose these kind of torture. This is basically torture and terrorism, where you're scaring the people disproportionately. They're thinking 100 times more people have died. That, I think, he's not just a Fidel Castro situation. It's actually something much worse. This is potentially a crime against humanity. In my view, it's a very, very severe matter. When the numbers finally come in, they will be in the hundreds of thousands across the world and potentially in the millions. And that is potentially, therefore, more than the actual deaths from the virus.
So you are familiar with the Constitution of Australia, and most probably also the Constitution of Victoria. So the Constitution of Victoria is totally suspended. We understand that with those measure of exceptions that in my book should not exist. You're totally right. The Swedish response to that should prevail also in Australia. We should only have measures of exceptions in case of war. And if you look back at the Second World War, there were never those kind of measure of exceptions that we have today in place. Curfews were not the thing. We have curfews today. I think that's the first time in Australian history. I may be wrong, but I cannot find another time where this happened. But in the Australian Constitution, there is that section 109, whereby there is the possibility for the Commonwealth government to legislate in such a way that the states have to adjust the legislations to be in harmony with that. I mean, I forgot the exact wordings, but in other words, the state cannot contradict the Commonwealth law. And so there is that possibility for the Commonwealth to pass a legislation today to actually adjust the Victorian situation. Yet when I look at the Prime Minister, I mean, I hear a few words against Andrews, but by and large, you've got those national cabinets with all the premiers, and from what Daniel Andrews says, well, the Prime Minister said to me in private this and that. I mean, it sounds like compliments. So I'm not sure whether the Prime Minister is just keeping his powder dry, but certainly on the action front, you see a lot of words, you see no actions. So when he says, we are all in this together, well, Prime Minister, how about you start getting the legislations to be adjusted in the state of Victoria? That is one thing that you can do, because it is in the Australian Constitution, unless this Australian Constitution is not worth the paper it's written on. What do you think?
You're spot on there. You picked a very sore spot that I've been, also experiencing in my mind. That the failure is not just Victoria's. The failure here is Australia-wide. And in fact, as you are aware, its failure is global. In the UK, things are potentially almost as bad. India, things got bad. So what has happened is, I think the great hysteria has meant that even the Commonwealth has stopped thinking. It's not just Victoria. So when you talk about this section, I will go and have a look at that. What I was going to say is I'm not really that familiar with the Australian Constitution or the Victorian Constitution. I've been mostly in the economic policy space. But at the moment, I'm starting to look at this issue, and I believe that the Commonwealth could have exercised some control in terms of biosecurity laws and other things that could prevent some of these things, could force the government to only enact certain things which are, as you said, consistent with the biosecurity laws. However, I also, and that's analysis for further work, but I'm very convinced that the very idea of an emergency power, the very idea that the public health legislation can override all common sense, to me that needs a lot of exploration. I do not agree with these kind of laws. And what I've done here, Albert, is after getting out, a couple of people from the Liberal Party contacted me recently. I'm not obviously going to take names, but these guys were, telling me about the need for to fight Daniel Andrews and so on. And my point is, hey guys, are you aware that your own leaders aren't actually saying much against these lockdowns? You're probably aware that these are the ones who are supporting it and not taking action, as you rightly said, Scott Morrison and so on. So I've actually put out publicly a couple of things. They're saying that any political party in Australia that commits to a due policy process for crisis of this sort, greater transparency. I mean, I need to know what is the advice that these guys are getting at the top. This is not good enough to say it's cabinet in confidence. Sorry, it's a matter of life and death for thousands of people.
Exactly.
It's no longer an issue where you say, I'm going to hide my information. I would rather have all cabinet submissions published immediately after the cabinet meeting so that everybody can see what the decision makers are thinking about. In a crisis situation, let there be greater disclosure. And at the same time, we are having less disclosure. So I believe that I've told these political parties and publicly that any political party that will follow the due process, will abolish these peacetime emergency powers, will ensure that people who kill who take additional lives due to their orders, public health orders, like the ones that's happening, suicides, they are punished. I think all this madness will stop immediately. This could not have started if these guys, if people like Dan Andrews were aware that they would actually go to jail for any additional death arising from their lockdowns.
Yeah.
You think they'd do that? They'd be not doing that, right?
Yeah, you are right. There is a lack of accountability.
Absolutely.
And the lack of accountability is due to the fact that there is no punishment.
No.
So there is, I'm sure you may be aware that there is this class action against the Victorian government. So there are hundreds, if not thousands, of businesses that are joining this class action. Are you aware of it?
Look, I'm broadly aware of it. I haven't paid attention much to it. But I guess my point is the current laws are insufficient. Yes, by all means use current laws, but we need a movement. We need an Australian movement all across Australia to stop these emergency powers completely and to punish those. I want any politician who issues an order by which a single additional suicide takes place or a single additional cancer death takes place. I want that politician behind bars, okay? That's not currently there. I mean, the manslaughter laws that you refer to are probably not anywhere in that league where they're looking at the actual data. Because how do you know it's an additional suicide? You can only know from the data. It's not a coroner situation where there's a direct link between an order issued by the health minister and a particular suicide. You cannot connect the two. But you look at the data and you can see clearly that there's been a huge bump in India, for example, there's a huge bump in suicides during the lockdown period. And that's how, if there is a bump in data, then that data itself is sufficient to cause somebody to go to jail. I don't think the laws exist at the moment, but I'm happy to be advised by any lawyer. As I said, I'm writing this paper, and if anybody can guide me, what are the laws that should be changed or should be used by the Commonwealth, by Victorians to fight back, happy to study them.
And you may have seen the latest polls. There was an article in the Financial Review on the weekend that suggests that many Victorians are actually very happy with Mr. Andrews' action. Personally, I think it's due to the fact that a lot of people are quite happy by receiving the aids, staying at home, not having to report to work, not having to report to their boss, being totally left to themselves. So there is a section of the community that I guess will be supportive of that, like in Cuba, a section of the community would have supported Fidel Castro as well. I think that you and I know better. You coming from India, and I'm coming from a part of the world where we've seen dictators up and down before my time, during my time, and it's quite incredible that there is that kind of mentality that is here.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's really staggering, Sanjeev. May I ask you about India? So you were saying that India is socialist. From the outside, we don't see India as a socialist country. I certainly didn't see like Gandhi being a socialist. I was wrong?
Yes, socialism has got a range. You can be ultra socialist like USSR, for example, right, where everything is a centrally planned and command and control economy. You can be less socialist, like China today. The socialist model there is that they are totalitarian. They will tell you they'll run the entire system as a public sector. They'll infiltrate the private sector. So that's the kind of socialism. And then you have the Indian type of socialism, which is a mixed economy, which was very popular at one time. And Jawaharlal Nehru, our first prime minister, was a fan of all the Fabian socialists. So this is called Fabian socialism. So the version that is applied in India is a socialism by stealth. The socialism by stealth model, they call the Fabian socialism, which is very popular with George Bernard Shaw and many others of this sort. That essay says that we will allow a democracy, we will allow a private sector, but we will control exactly what they do. And we will also take the commanding height of the economy. So in India, for example, even till today, the government runs hotels. The Ashoka Hotel, for example, it runs 11 hotels in India, major hotels. Mm-hmm. It runs the airlines, the Air India now, the Indian Airlines I think is gone. But basically what is, and it runs I think a few hundred at major public sector undertakings, okay? And almost all of them are making losses. So that is just one symptom of socialism, where the government bureaucrats are managing a significant part of the society. And by the way, I should mention here a very, very critical part. The entire financial system, and I'll use the word entire to mean something in the range of 95%. 95% of the financial system of India is managed by the government. The banks are owned by the government. India does not have private banks. It's only got a very few private banks which have just come up recently after some reforms, but almost all the banks in India are owned by the government. And when that happens, you will find immediately that the government banks are issuing loans politically. So if you as a businessman, I think you do some property business, you want some money, you go to to get the money from the bank, you actually have to go to the politician. Okay, and then you get the money from the bank. And you don't have to repay the money, by the way. You just don't have to repay the money. So the banks in India have an astronomical amount of non-performing debt. That is the money that's never going to come back, because the businesses who took the money are very well connected politically, and nothing can ever happen to them. So what you're seeing in India is a version of the USSR economy. And what happened in 1991? Not many people are aware that this extreme socialism, which Nehru had introduced, which was the Fabian socialist model, made India completely bankrupt. India was unable to pay back the foreign debt. It had taken loans from other parts of the world, and it could not pay back. So the IMF had to give them $5 billion. And the way they did that was they took all the gold from India. The gold deposits of the Central Bank of India were carried by planes, aeroplanes, all the way to England, in London, and stored there as a collateral before the IMF gave India any money. IMF also forced certain conditions. So when we talk of reforms in India, people like Manmohan Singh and Narasimha Rao, these are the names that come up. But actually they were not reformers at all. None of them were reformers. They never articulated one word of reform in their entire life before 1991. But in 1991, the IMF compelled India to liberalize. So basically, the Inspector Raj, the inspection system, or the controls on imports, many of them were reduced. Earlier, for example, in India, to get a telephone line, you had to apply to the government. The government supplied the telephones, and you had to wait for 2 years at least, and you had to pay bribes, a lot of bribes, to be able to get a telephone line. To get a scooter, the one that you drive around in India, there are a lot of small scooters, you actually had to apply, and you had to get a license, and you had to wait, and you had to bribe everybody. To get a transistor, you had to do that. And by the way, my father, who was in the government service, I'm aware of the kind of, licensing requirements for everything. You had to do that. So to cement, you could not produce cement in India unless the government allowed you to produce, and there were quotas. You could not produce more than this or less than that, And there was corruption at a very intricate level. So when I joined in 1982, I was not aware of all this corruption, okay? I was basically a student, and you'd think of everything going fine. And then I started seeing within the government an extraordinary amount of corruption. The corruption in India is from the prime minister, the premiers, or the chief ministers, we call them, all the way down to every single minister, down the way to every single bureaucrat, and all the way down to the grassroots in every single lowest level of official. There's a book being written by a Swiss professor about my work. So he's writing a book which is currently being drafted. But that book will explain my personal journey on the discovery of the socialism. So I wrote the summary of all this, by the way, is found in my book called Breaking Free of Nehru, which was published in 2008 by the British publisher Anthem Press. That book will explain to you India does not have constitutional property rights. You have no rights in India, property rights. The government can confiscate your property at any point in time, and it does it. The farmers cannot buy and sell their own produce. They cannot sell their produce. Only yesterday, by the way, and you'll notice that I've commended Modi on this reform. Only once after 75 years now have we allowed farmers to buy and sell their own produce. Like tomatoes, a farmer produces, he cannot actually sell them, he has to sell to the government agency. Therefore, in virtually all of these matters, and within the government itself in India, there are extraordinary socialist incentives. So I was paid virtually nothing. My salary was almost close to zero, and I'm a senior civil servant in India. And the understanding in India was that you are in government, you should make money from bribes. Everybody around me was taking bribes in order to survive. Okay, I'm not doing any of that, and I'm really annoyed with the whole system, and I'm therefore trying to figure out what's wrong. And so India continues to be an extraordinarily socialist society. And if you start, engaging in India for business, you will soon find yourself swamped in this socialist quagmire. Permissions, quotas, licensing. You will have to bribe 1,000 people in order to start a business in India. And you cannot continue your business till you have actually been bribing every single person around. So, yeah, India is extraordinarily socialist.
So, as a property developer at some stage, we were trying to sell in India, and we did find it to be a complete waste of time.
There you go.
And interestingly enough, I know that China and India are competing, but we had no issues about selling into China. It seems that the Chinese system allowed their residents to purchase properties in Australia. We sold lots of properties to Chinese people, but unfortunately not too many to Indians. But to go back to the Victorian system, so your experience in socialism, do you see some parallels with the Dan Andrews government? Are we going now
Absolutely.
into socialism in Victoria?
He is going into pure communism. I think there's an extreme level of socialism. Fabian socialism is a bit of mild socialism, the one we have in India. And then we have the ultra-socialism, which becomes communism. And this is very close to communism. I mentioned to Peter Credlin in the Sky News that, look, if you look at the orders that are issued by the government, these restrictions, lockdown orders, I had a quick look at them, a bit of a PDF file of some sort with the industry listed on one side and what it can do listed on the other side. This is called central planning. Central planning is the hallmark of communism. Okay, let's be very clear. Central planning tells you that you are no longer, you have no more agency and no more freedom as a human being in this country, and thou shalt therefore do exactly what I tell you. And if you belong to this industry, you can do that, and if you belong to that industry, you can do that. That is pure communism, okay? We cannot call it socialism. They
decide what industry is essential and which one is not.
Exactly. And that is, by the way, the same thing we have in India. There is an Essential Commodities Act, which is hidden behind the 9th schedule of the Indian Constitution, which they still allows the government to do all these kind of fiddly things about this industry will allow that, that is actually illegal and fundamentally wrong. And so we never had this situation where industries were being singled out for certain things. When you look at Friedrich Hayek, the great economist and philosopher, he believes that all the laws of government should be general laws. A general law applies to every citizen regardless of his geographical location or the kind of occupation. So there are general principles that apply. In this case, and the occupational health and safety, by the way, is a very good example of a general law where there are performance standards. There's a general duty on the employer to ensure the health and safety. Okay, that is a general law. And within the general law, each industry works out what is best for it. But here we have the central planner saying that if you are in that industry, like Jim's mowing, he's been getting really annoyed, I notice. And the poor guy is right. Because why are we allowing, the Aldi, in Aldi when I go, I'm facing the person who passes by, from the Aldi, or I'm facing, consumers and buyers, they're everywhere, right? And I'm so much in close touch with them, and I've got the mask, etc. But this guy from James Mowing, he comes to your house, he's going to be outside in your lawn, and you as a central planner believe that he cannot go and mow his lawn. Now, this is actually communism on steroids. It is not just socialism, Albert, this is communism 100%. Okay, so when we talk of these kind of things that are going on, I do not see this anymore as a free society. I see this as a complete replica of China, in fact, potentially worse than China.
So the Belt Road Initiative that was signed by Daniel Andrews, do you see that as a coincidence?
Look, that's completely weird. I really don't understand why would a Western nation sign up to China. You know, China is such a deadly country. I have been so vigorously fighting China, in India through my videos and so on. These guys have been attacking India's border. They have been terrorizing. China is currently terrorizing the entire world. All the Asian countries, the small countries, they're also trying to terrorize India. Now, India won't do that easily, okay? But they've been trying. They've killed 20 soldiers and so on. This is a country that also does all these, what are called these cyber attacks. Australia has admitted that China, without saying the name, they've admitted that there's a country trying to attack us all the time. When you have such a country that's basically publicly terrorizing everybody around it, and also attacking you on a daily basis in Australia, then I want to know from Dan Andrews, who gave him the wisdom? What kind of a wisdom was that to not consult with the Commonwealth's experts in this matter and to go around signing these kind of Belt and Road initiatives? I just find it mind-boggling, that this is happening in front of my eyes. Now, by the way, the Belt and Road China thing was not something that I was going to resign my job for. It was not bothering me personally at this stage, but fundamentally a bad idea. So I can assure you there are public servants who believe a lot of bad things are going on right now in this government, but obviously they can't resign every 2 minutes for that, okay? And that's one of the reasons why this continues. But as I said, at the moment, I've decided to be political. And the reason I'm political is because I have asserted my citizenship. I'm an Australian citizen. I have the right to freedoms, okay? I have the right to know why you're doing certain things. I insist, and I have repeatedly said in India, in fact, the slogan of our party in India is, Sarkar Hamari Naukar Hai. I'll tell you what it means. It means the government is our servant. That's in big banners all over the country where we're putting on walls everywhere. That's our slogan. And Margaret Thatcher emphasized this point. This has been a great fight for the last so many 100 years after the Glorious Revolution. We ensure the king does not believe himself to be our master, but he's a servant paid to organize the society on our behalf. I cannot understand the idea of our servant trying to restrict our freedoms in such a way. Therefore, I have come out and I'm at the moment extremely political in Australia for the first time. I've come out from the shadows and I will fight these guys within my limited capacity, which is what I'm doing right now. I'll be writing, I'll be tweeting, I'll be asking the people to ask questions. This is what we need to do right now. We need to wake up, guys.
Yeah. And fortunately, Sanjeev, the Australian Constitution, which is where the rights of Australians are embedded into, needs a serious reform because there are only 5 fundamental rights for Australians, and freedom isn't one of them. I'm sure I'm surprising you when I'm saying that, but in Australia, there is no freedom of speech. It's all allowed by Act of Parliament. Like, for instance, if you were today to give advice on stocks, on the Australian stock market, and you're not a journalist or a stockbroker, you will have ASIC coming and knocking at your door. There are many measure of exceptions that are like that. Yeah. It is unfortunate. But there is a serious need for constitutional reform in this country. And if not, you need to have leaders in federal government that are prepared to legislate so that states would actually be curbed to fit within the legislation of the Commonwealth. I mean, you were talking about closing of borders. I don't think that it's normal that we've got states closing borders. I mean, in my passport, it says Australian. It doesn't say Victorian. No. In Queensland, it doesn't say Queenslander. So yes. we are all Australian. There should not be any closure of any borders. It's not everyone will look after his own corner and God will look after all of us. It's not that kind of... We should not be in that kind of mentality. Now, I want to take you to a different place because, after all, you're an economist. The federal government has borrowed to the hilt. Not just the federal government. Of course, we know that the Victorian government now is indebted over 110 billion. I think after this crisis, it'll probably be more around 150 billion dollars. But how do we get out of this debt? Is there a way that you as an economist look at this? Because the numbers give you turn your head, you know.
I'm reminded of this is something which I can talk about, I suppose, or maybe I should not talk about it in that manner. Let's say I've been talking publicly about this. Let's say just talk about the public part rather than any other part. The answer is very simple. The answer is not, I think these are some common sense things. Just let people get back to work and they will recover. Okay, so this whole exercise of stimulating the economy, giving people extra benefits here or there, and that's the kind of strategy that people are talking about. That's not actually the driver that's not solving the problem, because you cannot solve a problem when people can't work. So you need to actually get people back to work. So I think the step one for recovery is not by borrowing more money, which is what they're trying to do all the time, and building more roads, and building more this, and building more that. Infrastructure may be potentially viable in certain kinds of recessions. This is not that kind of a recession. It's not a financial recession. It's not a liquidity problem. It's not a crisis of trust between businesses and the bankers. You're actually creating the problem of mortgagors not being able to pay back their mortgage to banks. So you might actually end up by creating a financial crisis. So what I'm trying to say here is that the problem is not related to the typical Keynesian or any other remedy. It's not subject. We cannot use any of those. We have to use a straightforward scientific remedy, which is to get people back to work, particularly the young, let them have the mask. And I was talking to another business leader on the phone, I think it was. And I think the idea was that businesses can actually be just given the performance-based thing, that you need to have certain safety standards and meet all those things, and you let them manage it in their own way. You're a property developer, somebody else, restaurant industry. They can all work out their best solution and age-based risk profiling, and you let them carry on with their life. If you go on interfering and telling everybody exactly what they need to do, it's like breaking somebody's leg, first of all, and then saying, here's a crutch. Doesn't work.
So I heard the Premier say a week or so ago that people don't have to pay their rent in Victoria until March. You can just imagine the devastation that this is going to cause, and the sovereign issue that's going to cause with the banks.
Yeah, this is exactly the kind of thing I mentioned as well with my own property as well. I've got a small tiny student apartment in Box Hill. The moment this thing happened, I couldn't find anybody. The person left. They had to go back to their country, I think in Africa. And then I had to drop my rent, which I dropped by about 15%. Couldn't find anybody, dropped it further. At the moment, I've dropped it to about 35% lower than my normal, and I then found finally somebody. And that person again had to go back home because the situation there and at home required them. Luckily, I found another person. What I'm saying is that the land property owners, because I'm just extrapolating this problem, that it is a crisis of unbelievable proportions. People who put their entire life and in developing a kind of investment portfolio of this sort, they are now. I still have to pay my bank the money, the loan. It's not that the bank is exempting me from that. So what happens then? We're basically impoverishing the investors of Australia, and at some point they will not be in a position to pay back to the banks. And as you rightly said, at that time we can start seeing potential signs, and I'm not saying it will happen because there's so many tools available to the RBA and to the Commonwealth and state governments. I'm not saying that it will happen, but there's a potential risk, and I'm sure all the policymakers are aware that this has to be managed in such a way. But what you're saying is that what you can see clearly is that the development industry is going to be completely shocked, because nobody out there is going to start people who invested in property will lose their faith very badly, because they've been bitten very badly. And particularly if you have 5 or 10 properties, let's say, you're in deep distress because you might not have 2 or 3 for the whole year. There might be no money coming in, and you still have to pay your rent, your interest to the bank. Yeah, so this is the circular system of a functioning economy, which is so beautifully described by Adam Smith and the Hayek, and there are hundreds of thousands of good economists explain it and study it. That's been broken at a number of spots. The economy has been actively attacked by bad policies. These are communist policies. Yeah. Thou shalt do this, and so on. And that, by the way, communism never works.
You are so right. When you start talking about not respecting properties, this is a sign of communism. And when you're starting to say people don't have to pay their rents, this is not a priority anymore, that is definitely a sign.
Definitely communism. I'm very good at identifying this thing, and people are always challenging me, this is not communism. Well, actually, communism is the actual performance of government, what it does. So if they had done the right policy process, even today, if they consult you, for example, you're a property developer, if they consult everybody, they put out their arguments, and then they come out with a policy that, okay, maybe we need a lockdown here. I'd still be saying that's okay. But when you do it unilaterally, like a star chamber, where you're saying, I know everything, and I don't tell anybody anything, but I control 6 million people, and I'm going to tell them every single detail about what they can do and how long they can go out for exercise. Imagine the situation. Vitamin D is good for you. You go, and people going out in the beach and you beat them up if they don't have a mask. I mean, this is absolutely...
That makes no sense.
It
makes no sense.
This Brett Sutton guy has actually... I've asked him repeatedly, what's your evidence for virus transmitting in the open air, particularly a windy day like this? We've got a windy spring out there, just outside my house here. How does a virus transmit in this manner? It doesn't. And so now you're busy beating up people for that. You're basically stopping people from exercise. You're stopping them to get relaxation, social. I mean, people, I'm at least lucky to have my wife and daughter. What about people who have nobody at home? I mean, they are suffering.
Sanjeev, the loophole of this virus is that you can be outside in the sunlight and you won't be contaminated. That's the only instance that we actually know the virus can get to you. And that has been denied to people.
Yeah. So, the way you get the vitamin D, defend yourself, build your health, build your mental health, all those things have been attacked. So I think the situation has been a nightmare in terms of policy. And I think the whole thing begins with the laws. Our laws in Australia, you're absolutely right, need a review. There's, by the way, a lot of so Australia is not helpless. I think when I say it's a free society, I actually mean it is a free society. And I believe the courts will potentially come out and hammer the government for doing these things. And the reason is there's a thing called common law. Like England does not have a constitution. I mean, the whole point about the Westminster system and
they have a Bill of Rights.
But the idea here really is, yes, they have that, but the idea is that the fundamentals are not necessarily built through the constitution. The fundamentals are built by the common law, by the courts. And so Australia has a strong tradition of common law. And that will actually ultimately save us. Even if we don't change the constitution, I believe the courts will have the wisdom, and I hope they have the wisdom, to put our public taxpayer-funded servants who are trying to tell us that they are doing in our welfare all these activities, they'll put them in their right place and say, sorry, you did not prove your case. Your orders were ultra-virus. They were outside your scope of, your powers. Not because you did not have them theoretically. Yes, they have theoretically the power, but in terms of common law, they've betrayed the property rights, for example. And I think some lawyers have started raising this matter. You're probably right about these, the ones who are going for these class actions. There might be some of those arguments being made there based on common law, actually.
Mm-hmm. Well, Sanjeev, it was absolutely a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you for your generosity of your time. I know that you are increasingly busy now that you are out in the open, no longer in the shadow. It's great to know that you are here with us in Australia and defending, voicing the rights of the people. That's fantastic.
Thank you very much, Albert, for having me. It's a great pleasure, a delightful conversation. Thank you very much.